Hello and welcome to episode 112 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're back after a few weeks off. The CDL was off, but we are back. The CDL is back for this week, and we'll be doing predictions at the end of the show. But we have some ROSTERMANIA news to talk about. We have some drama to talk about, which is always somewhat fun. This is more fun than the last drama that we talked about, including Scrap and Draza. That wasn't, that's a little more of a touchy subject. This is more like classic COD beef that we'll be talking about today. And we have some map and weapon changes for the next few weeks of the CDL, and we'll see how that's been working because I've seen a lot of complaints on Twitter about it. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Doing pretty well, coming off roughly 48 hours ago. UConn won back-to-back national championships, so that was fun. And before the Yankees lost to the terrible Marlins tonight, they were doing well too. So, been a couple good days, and yeah, ready to break down everything that's been going on since we last spoke to the people.
48 hours removed from a UConn national championship and 48 hours away from Dan Hurley announcing his move to Kentucky. It should be an incredible 100 or so hours for the Binkowski household. But we'll have to see. But we do have, we have confirmed roster moves in the CDL. John Calipari to Arkansas, Dan Hurley to Kentucky, Rick Pitino to UConn. We'll get to all of that in due time. So the roster changes that happen in the CDL. Let's start with the biggest, the one that we talked about quite a bit on the last episode that we did. Boston. We were debating what should Boston do heading into these major three qualifiers because they're in last place in the CDL. I don't think they haven't won a single match at a major so far this season, which has really dragged them down in the standings. We both agreed, I think, that they shouldn't make a roster change, or at least that they wouldn't make a roster change. We were definitely wrong on that front. Boston has decided to make a two-pronged roster change heading into the major three qualifiers. They are now parting ways with Slasher and Asim. So Asim was only there for Major 2 qualifiers and Major 2 Slasher since the beginning of the season. So those two are out. And Beans and Pentagram are in. Both these players had already been signed and were part of the Breach Academy. Pentagram, not Beans. Oh, but Beans was on last season's CDL roster. Pentagram was their official substitute for this season. He was on the Breach Academy. He was also, I think, LA Thieves substitute last year or 2 years ago. I think it might have been 2 years ago now.
Years, yeah.
When they won the World Championship. So that's the roster change now. We got Beans and Pentagram in, Slasher, Asim out. First thoughts from you, Bink. Is this a good or a bad move from the Boston Breach?
Well, I don't remember exactly what we said last time we were talking about this move, but I remember going player by player and breaking down like how it was tough for me personally to see how you could justify dropping each individual player. Like I just remember going through like Asim, they just picked them up. Flasher, the vet, you trying to, have him show Snoopy the ropes. And historically, when Slasher has gotten dropped in the past, it hasn't always worked out for the team that dropped him. Priesta coming off a world championship, and then Snoopy seemingly the face of the franchise and the player they build around heading into this season. So it really, to me, didn't seem like there was a clear-cut answer, despite them being towards the bottom of the standings and seemingly needing to make a change. But yeah, I was pretty surprised that Asim was let go just again due to how briefly he was on the team. There was seemingly some behind-the-scenes issues within the squad, as we've seen over the past couple of days on the Flank and Breaking Points podcast with Slasher and Censor. If you guys haven't seen the drama around that and all that stuff, definitely go check it out. There's some funny moments and whatnot in that. But long story short, it seemed like there was some internal issues behind the scenes with the squad, and that a change needed to be made. And seemingly the direction that Boston wants to go in is to continue to develop and build around Snoopy, which means that players that were seemingly against that idea or just thinking that Snoopy needed more time to develop in challengers before being ready for the CDL stage, those players are seemingly now out, and they are bringing in other players around him. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how it plays out for Boston. In general, I think it's hard to say that like Beans is an upgrade over Slasher. Like that seems like a ludicrous statement to make in terms of like a positional breakdown, because you would seemingly you would have Beans be the main AR, which Slasher was on paper. And just with the way Slasher is played historically and even this year in limited matches on LAN, it's gonna be pretty tough for Beans to do better than he did. But again, if there was chemistry and internal issues beyond what's happening on the map and that stuff, then it's hard to really balance that between just the stats and all that stuff. Pentagram, though, I am excited to see what he's capable of. It seems like he's been a name for several years now that, like you mentioned, even with LA Thieves dating back to a couple of years ago, and the last couple of years with Boston, always been a name floated around as a substitute, but never really got a shot in the CDL as a starter. Now he has that opportunity, despite backs against the wall, being on a team struggling. So it's not going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination for him, but he's getting his chance. So I'm excited to see what he's capable of. But yeah, there's definitely some stuff going on behind the scenes. At least it sounded like with the whole Slasher and Sensor stuff that made it seem like this Boston team could be struggling for the rest of the year. But also at the same time, with chemistry issues and whatnot, you make multiple player changes. Might be a honeymoon phase or something like that coming up here at the start of the qualifiers. We could see Boston try to flip the switch. But yeah, definitely was very surprised by these moves, and we'll have to see how they play out.
So here's the numbers for Boston so far this season. We're through two major cycles. So we had 14 qualifying matches, and then Boston, because they haven't won a match on LAN, they've only had two or three major LAN matches. So 17, 18 matches total so far for Boston. 17 actually total for Boston. They are 5-12 in the CDL. That is the worst record in the league, with a 29% match win percentage. Therefore, they are last in the CDL with 50 CDL points, 10 points behind 11th, and they're 25 points behind 8th place Carolina right now. So Carolina would be the last team to make champs if season ended today. Boston has a 41% map win percentage, which is not the worst in the CDL. It's about halfway up. So they're about mediocre. So they're having some close series theoretically, better than teams like LAG, Carolina. Seattle has the worst map win percentage despite having one additional win and 20 CDL points more than Boston. The roster change surprised me, but it's not like I'm outraged by this, because if you don't want to be replaced, do better. And I'm not saying like Slasher and Asim are the reason that they are doing poorly. It's a 4-man team. That everybody has a lot of responsibility for how these teams do, whether that's good or bad. Whether you win a championship and you might not have statistically the best stats, like someone like Priesta with New York last year, he deserved a ton of credit for them winning a championship last year, despite not having the stats that someone like Hydra would. On the same side of that coin, though, you have to take responsibility for not doing well as a team, and that unfortunately leads to roster changes. And in this case, it leads to Slasher and Asim being replaced. The thing with me with Snoopy, because that's been kind of like the thing that people have been really talking about this past week since the roster change was announced. I think I know that Snoopy has the most potential of anybody on the Breach. Like, I think Slasher at his peak was probably, you know, the best player. Like he was a better player than Snoopy may be at his peak, depending on how Snoopy develops. But I don't think Slasher is, you know, envy Slasher anymore. And at that point, I'm not that surprised that Slasher would be replaced or something. Beans is kind of an interesting replacement. And like you said, I'm excited to see Pentagram because I just want to see these guys that have kind of like really grinded away in challengers, been waiting patiently for their spot, that they finally get that. And I'm excited to see what he can do with it. But like I said on the pre-show, or maybe it was before we went live. I see some similarities between this Boston situation and what happened with New York and Hydra at the end of the 2022 season. If people remember, obviously New York was in a much different situation because they had an incredible finish to that season where they finished second at the final major and qualified for champs at the very last moment. And then I don't remember them doing anything really notable at champs that year, but regardless, they had a really good end to the year, and then shit hit the fan, and everything got leaked or really got just thrown out there on stream between Crimsix, Paulex, D-Real, Hydra, the subliners management that that New York was kind of coddling Hydra, that he wasn't committed to the team, that he would just kind of blow off things that he shouldn't. He wasn't a professional. And I think a lot of the same things could be applied to Snoopy. It's not a one-to-one fit. I'm not saying that it's like, you know, Snoopy is Hydra 2.0. But at the same point, I think teams are going to give more leniency to younger, talented players. That's always going to happen. Like, if you think it happens in Call of Duty, it happens in professional sports as well. Guys that do dumb stuff in pro sports, you get away with that dumb stuff if you're really good at your sport most of the time. And right now, if Snoopy doesn't know spawns and hardpoint, which was something that was kind of alluded to with, you know, by Slasher, then that may be. He still has a lot of potential. And Boston is probably correct in trying to bet on that potential rather than say, hey, Snoopy, go down and spend the next 4 months in challengers and then we'll see you next season. I think let him develop in the CDL. It's not about coddling him, but it's about trying to actually get him like first level, top level experience. And I think playing against CDL level talent in these matches is way more valuable experience than playing in challengers, because he's probably going to be the best player in the lobby in challengers. He's not going to be the best player in the CDL, and he's got to get that experience to be as good as he might be able to be in the future. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I wanted to just kind of make the connection between him and Hydra, because it seems like it's more of an immaturity, maybe like an entitlement thing. Allegedly, obviously, all of this is stuff that's being claimed or alluded to on stream, but it seems like this is more a young, very talented player kind of taking for granted what that opportunity that they're receiving is, and just really not giving it their all. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, like the specifics behind this potential drama and situation, like whether Snoopy does or doesn't know certain spawns in certain situations. I don't think that, well, if it is true, then that's kind of inexcusable for a professional player, just regardless of, how green he is in terms of being new to competitive. I believe Sensor was like claiming, it's literally been less than a year since he's been eligible to play variant, and let alone play while communicating in English, which I don't believe is his first language. So there are similarities there between Hydra. So I like that comparison you made, regardless of, like you said, not being a one-to-one comparison. But for me, at the end of the day, regardless of the specifics behind that, I feel like now that all of this has happened, Austin just needs to have a serious sit down with Snoopy if they haven't already, and be like, look, like, it's us basically saying we're putting everybody's asses on the line, and we believe in you. And if this spawn stuff is true or not true, like, you gotta, if you've been giving us 100%, you need to give us 120. If you've been giving us 80%, you need to be giving us over 100 now. That sort of thing, like where it's like, made abundantly clear that whatever's happened in the past, that's over and done with. You can't go back and change that. But you gotta, put in the time. We believe in you as Boston, and you know, you gotta make yourself. You gotta prove yourself now. You're in the spotlight in that regard, and basically everyone believing in him is putting their potential futures in the CDL on the line, or at the very least, yeah, if he continues to struggle, it's potentially the end of his career, right? So there's, definitely more interest in for me personally now going forward and how Snoopy performs. I know we have definitely mentioned throughout this year, uh, since Boston has struggled, there hasn't been a lot of scenarios, but it feels like in a lot of cases where Boston was winning games, it felt like there were Snoopy pop-off performances. I just remember one, don't even remember who it was, but I just remember talking about one of the qualifiers where it was like Snoopy and Capsule, back when Capsule was still on the team, both played really well, and we were kind of like, is this what it's going to take for Boston to win? Now, if they're seemingly fully supporting him and building around him, it's like, okay, you're our guy. You got to show us what you can do, and you got to show the world what you can do now because you're under the microscope. Uh, you know, anytime he probably struggles in a match now, there's probably gonna be comments in the YouTube chat and all that stuff. So definitely gonna be interesting to see how that plays out. But that's the bigger picture thing for me is more important here than the specifics behind what did or didn't happen now, especially since the changes are confirmed for Boston, right? Like, we've seen in the past players get dropped and stuff is said about what happens, and obviously emotions play a factor in that. Not that I am saying I don't believe Slasher, because I think Slasher is one of the more transparent pros in Call of Duty, and he always is seemingly calling out other players BS, and he's willing to be very vocal about what should and shouldn't be happening in the league and that sort of stuff. So I trust Slasher that it potentially was an issue, and now that he is no longer a part of the team, there's nothing we can do other than see what Snoopy is really capable of, and all that stuff, like the excuses of hasn't been playing that long and variant, English not a first language. You kind of gotta fight through all that stuff and do what you can and try and improve. And I know it's not a direct comparison with Hydra, but that I do think that is a good analogy, because obviously Hydra coming over from uh, Europe, having the language barrier and all that stuff, it eventually did lead to a world championship. Not saying that's exactly what could happen here with Snoopy, but seemingly you got to think that's what Boston. If Boston is deciding to build around him, they got to believe at the end of the day, he has the potential to get them there. So definitely more pressure on him going forward, I feel like.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on the Dens and Zed front of like sitting down with Snoopy is like a heart to heart, like we're not just like risking this season, like just like, oh, we won't make champs. Like, no, like we're risking like our jobs, our job security or whatever, or our reputations, because we believe in you. So you have to believe in us and like put the work in. Like if you're not putting in the work right now, then shame on you, but get it done anyway, because we've already made this decision. We're already riding with you, so there's no going back now. Like the only way that this ends is like with all of us looking really good in the end, a la New York, or all of us being out of jobs and looking like fools in 3 or 4 months. But yeah, like I said, with the Hydra comparison, it is not a perfect 1-to-1, because Hydra, before he even got into the CDL, showed like a phenom level of talent that like people were buzzing about his arrival before he was even eligible to play in the CDL. Someone like Simp or Celium, like those guys are like, they were anticipated to be great. Snoopy was obviously very good because he got signed like almost immediately, but it's not to that same degree as it was with Hydra. And you know, but at the end of the day, at the end of the 2022 season, New York made a decision. They said, okay, bye Crim6, bye Paul. We're going to keep Kismet with Hydra, and we're gonna build around Hydra. They got one of his best friends in Skies, which was like I want people to go back and look at Twitter. People were criticizing that move, saying, "Oh, it's just because he plays Valorant with them or
Yep.
whatever." That was a derided move, despite Skies being like an MVP candidate like 2 seasons before that, and like one of the better players for Florida. So that was a criticized move. And then they bring in Priesta, who people were like, well, he's not very good. Like, what are they going to do? Like, he didn't have a great season with Minnesota before that. So I'm just saying, like, it's not about picking out like star players or whatever to pair around him. It's about picking the right players to pair around him. Kismet is a perfect player to play next to Hydra. I think Kismet is the perfect player to play with pretty much any submachine gun player. So like he's perfect. Unfortunately, there's only one Kismet, and Boston does not have him. But if maybe obviously Priesta, there is a connection there. Like he already saw it with Hydra. Maybe the same could be done with Snoopy. Maybe Pentagram or Beans. Maybe they can develop into a moldable player to complement Snoopy's talents or cover up some of his weaknesses or deficiencies. It's obviously there's a lot of ifs, there's a lot of ands, there's a lot of buts, but that's literally the case with all of these young players that aren't like Simp and Scump and Celium, like guys that just like instantly come in and they're like, we are literally the best players in the world, and there's not anything anyone can do to stop us. That's not the case with 95% of these new guys. And Snoopy, I think he has a bright future. We'll see what happens with Boston. But God have mercy on Den's and Zed's jobs right now, because it's they're gonna get clowned, they're gonna get ridiculed if things go poorly. And part of that also, I should admit, is that they dropped Asim doing it. Slasher's one thing, he's a well-respected pro. Asim is a very, very well-liked player in the scene, and he's very well-liked by really important, like very vocal voices. He's one of Zuma's friends, so when the flank gets thousands and thousands of viewers, and when you drop one of his friends, Zuma is not going to take that kindly. It's the same thing that happened with LAG before the season, where they didn't pick up Asim's roster for the Gorillas, and Enable went on stream and criticized LAG's coach for that without knowing anything about him or knowing much about the players in general. That's literally what this is. Like, and I'm not saying Asim deserved to get dropped. I'm not saying that in the slightest. I'm just saying like he's a bad player to drop because he's gonna get the sympathy and he's gonna have the support on social media, and it's gonna make it look worse than if you drop just Slasher, because Slasher has his enemies. People, you either dislike him or like him. There's not a lot of gray with Slasher. That's a lot different with Asim.
I just the thing with Asim really, to me, that rubs me the wrong way is just it was such a
yeah, that
quick
too
turnaround, and you didn't like you brought up the LAG stuff start of the season. He went into challengers, proved himself the start of this year, winning that first event, and then gets picked up, only gets 6 weeks with the team, because I guess 5 weeks of the qualifier and a week for the major, less than 2 months in the pro league, and now he's back in challengers. Like he was one of the guys who earned his spot. Like you can't debate what he did. He was in the pro league, didn't get a spot, went down challengers, proved he belongs by winning challengers, got another spot again, and now he's just out of a job. So despite the the fan element of it, just from a gameplay perspective, it's disappointing that his tenure wasn't longer. But as we have seen again historically with Asim, with the numerous times we've seen a CDL org tweet, hey, you dropped this at another team that dropped Asim, and then they beat him with the new team. Feels like an inevitability that Asim will be back in the pro league at some point. Maybe not this year, because we are now officially at the halfway point. So that'll just depend on if teams are still making changes after this and not. But worst case scenario, he should be back in the league in whatever state it's in next year. And then we should inevitably get an Asim revenge match against Boston.
Yeah, that is definitely true, that he didn't get a ton of time at all. to kind of integrate into the roster and make an impact. I think to make another NYSL comparison before we get off the topic, I kind of think of it as like Paul X during that 22 season. Like he came in mid-season. I think he replaced Clay, if I remember correctly. And he had an impact, like a very noticeable impact. Like their placings improved like immediately after bringing him in. And then I don't think New York definitely did not retain him. I think he ended up with London to start the next season. And like to circle it back to Asim, like he really needs to be best friends with a superstar because that superstar could protect him in these roster changes. Like I'm not saying like Snoopy necessarily could protect him, but like if he found himself onto like, Optic, of course, like he cozies up with Shotzi. Like Shotzi might be able to be like, no, we're not going to drop him. He needs someone in a good, valuable place to understand what he does for a team and like, okay, like despite whatever stats he might have, like no, Asim's actually valuable what we need to do. And so like we're not gonna drop him. It's kind of like the Kismet thing. Like Kismet's not gonna drop like 1.2, 1.3s on a consistent basis, but that's not why you have him. Like he's there to kind of like clean up some of the mess that other players can make. And I don't know. I hope like I
And
don't.
on occasion, he'll drop a 1.2 and win MVP.
Yeah, and then talk shit to Scrap. So, but I do hope that Asim, comes back into the league. I'm in Slasher as well, but it's just like there's only 48 spots in the CDL, and there's so much competition. And Boston had two former world champions on this team, and they won 5 matches so far this season. Like that's so they're averaging 2.5 wins per world champion. So it's been a tough season for this squad. Boston adjacent news. We should talk about the censor thing real quick because this includes the Slasher stuff, and this also includes kind of like where you stand with the Snoopy decision to keep him on the roster or whatever. So censor, you said he's ambiguous in terms of role within the Breach organization. If I remember correctly, when he signed with the Breach a few years ago or whatever that was, I believe he was announced as an ambassador, and then he kind of headed their Breach Academy team. He's since retired from competitive, but he still holds some kind of role within the Breach organization. And he and Slasher got into it on Dope Check, the Breaking Point podcast, and the I don't know if like they have like a start to their beef because I feel like they've been like somewhat at odds. Like they're just two big personalities. It's kind of like Aches and like literally any other personality in the CDO, like where you're like they kind of conflict. They're definitely not vibing with each other. I'm not sure exactly what the impetus was for Censor and Slasher to first start beefing. But Censor defends Snoopy, defends the Breach, all of that. Slasher, he has an axe to grind. Whether he's accurate with what he's saying or not, I no idea. We're just gonna have to kind of say, okay, like he says this, and the Breach are probably gonna say opposite. I don't know if you have any thoughts on Censor and Slasher and kind of their war of words on online for the past few days.
I think the strange thing again, I didn't listen to the full episodes of Breaking Point's pod or the flank, but the Breaking Point one in particular, I tried to listen to as much as I could, and it seemed like the one buzzword from Censor was unified. That Boston Breach wants to be unified in its decisions going forward. And the other thing he seemed to be stressing was that he doesn't have an official title right now with Boston, but he seemingly has enough authority or, um, you know, enough of a voice within the Boston camp to have some say in these moves and roster changes. So that is definitely interesting, especially when we know, kind of you mentioned Zed as head coach and Denz as GM. It's not like some of these other teams that don't have like a quote unquote GM, or they have, someone like Carolina where Brian Saint is the head coach and GM, right? Like, if they had somebody like Censor helping out, that might make a little more sense than a team like Boston that has a separate head coach and a GM. Um, Boston also now has Shawnee as an assistant coach. They had B Sport Josh, a European COD veteran who's no longer with them as a coach and being replaced by Shawnee seemingly as an assistant. So that's interesting. He was one of Censor's teammates on the Boston Academy team. Obviously played for some well-known EU teams over the years too, and the London Royal Ravens most recently, I believe. But regardless, yeah, I've at least talked to Slasher a couple times over the years, and he's always given me the vibe that he's somebody who says what's on his mind. He's not gonna shy away from saying what he thinks is the truth, and that seemed like the crux of this situation is that some stuff was being said about the Boston camp, and Slasher was like, nah, I gotta come out and say what's on my mind. So end of the day, it's a juicy back and forth between the two of them, and if you guys haven't heard any of it, definitely go check it out. But end of the day, yeah, I think the the main thing for them now is whatever Censor's role is with Boston now going forward, is he's in that same firing line, I guess, for lack of a better term, in terms of if Boston is quote unquote unified going forward, everybody who is quote unquote unified in this Snoopy project is they're either rising to the top or sinking with the ship essentially. So nothing else to say really. I just think there were some funny moments between the two of them for sure, but yeah, we're gonna have to see how it all plays out.
I think it's important, like I've been one to criticize Doug Censor Martin. That's true. But I do think it is also important to be unified in this kind of big of a decision, right? And this is a big decision because this kind of like, all right, if they really do poorly the rest of the year, like we're gonna back at this moment and say they really screwed up. They shouldn't have done that. They shouldn't have dropped Slasher. They shouldn't have dropped Asim. They shouldn't have kept Snoopy. Blah blah blah. And if they do really well from this point on, we're going to look like they were geniuses. They had the foresight to believe in Snoopy and whatever they were building. And it is important to unify around this, especially with his teammates. Because if you believe that he's like the future, a cornerstone of this franchise, and you have guys that are literally with him all the time that believe that he shouldn't have his position, that's going to create tension, and it could really create a lot of problems, and it might just like make him do worse and kind of be like a self-defeating thing in the end of like he has guys that are not rooting for his downfall, but certainly not helping it along the way. And some people do not respond well to the way Slasher like communicates. People don't always respond well to how Aches communicated, or Parasite. Parasite's probably the best example of this because Parasite was an incredible player who could not stay on a team for like past Impact for very long because he just rubbed people the wrong way. I remember a specific day in Black Ops 3 where he, I believe, got signed to Dream Team and then got dropped the same day because he rubbed Killa and like Spacely the wrong way during scrims, so they just dropped him instantly. Like these things happen. Like the way you communicate with people is super, super important. It's the same thing with Crimsix too. Crimsix is the most winningest player of all time, and a bunch of teammates didn't like playing with him because of the way he spoke to them. This happens in professional sports. It happens in esports. And I'm not saying Slasher is like the worst of this, but I could definitely see Slasher is very vocal. He's opinionated. He's probably correct on very many things, but it's also like sometimes not helpful to say some of the things that are, detrimental to the team chemistry or whatever the case may be. On the flip side, Censor is obviously a company man with Boston at this point. Like it would be really shocking if he went on to Dope Check and was like, yeah, Boston's doing something really stupid. And I think they're completely wrong in this choice. And also Censor, I think, has played with like literally every single member of Boston's roster now. Priesta maybe, but he definitely played with Snoopy in Challengers, and he might have played with Shawnee and Beans and Pentagram. So,
Definitely played with Pentagram and Snoopy. Beans is maybe, I'm not sure.
but so he's played with a good portion of this roster. He's familiar with probably all of these guys. So if he does have any influence, like, it would make sense why this team is the way it is right now. But I think it's gonna be interesting. Like, this is just I didn't think that the Boston Breach would be that interesting of a team this year, but they've kind of surprised me. They're doing a lot more than I thought they would. And on the last Boston point, if you want to talk about it, Sib, he talked about on the dope check that he was actually offered more money by the Breach in the offseason. So during the offseason, he was coming off of his second year with Seattle. He said that he was offered more money by the Breach than New York offered him, but then he chose to go to the Subliners, the defending world champions, because they gave him a better shot at winning and potentially winning a world championship. Any thoughts on that? I mean, that depends on how much, like he said, significantly higher pay. I don't really know what the scale is for some of these CDL players, like what is significantly higher, but if it's like 100 grand more, like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if I could say no to 100 grand more, even if I knew that that team was going to be worse than another team. I don't know what you're thinking.
No, I just thought that was an interesting point, and I do think I think maybe it was on the flank they were kind of mentioning it, like with the current layout of the league and the power dynamic between the top four, and the rest of the league. Like if you get a shot to team on one of those top four teams at this point, you kind of can't say no to that. Just because, I mean, obviously you'll have more of a better opportunity to make up some of that difference of prize winnings and whatnot. Obviously, for New York this year, might not work out that way just because of their last place finish at the first event. But obviously, that could all change by just winning champs at the end of the year, right? So, just an interesting tidbit there. But I am, I'm always conflicted, I guess, in terms of free agency and real life sports and stuff like that. I like to see players being rewarded for loyalty. Obviously, is a huge Derek Jeter fan, and
Aaron Judge.
um, and stuff like Freddie Freeman not getting to finish his career with the Braves. It obviously is seemingly potentially going to work out for both teams because the Braves and Dodgers are good now. But so stuff like that. It's always the business side of real life sports, and even the CDL is a different beast entirely. But it is interesting that Sib allegedly chose winning over a higher payday just in terms of salary, and that is something I will definitely keep in mind going forward because, like you said, there's probably not a ton of players who would make that same decision regardless of the teams, just in terms of like if you are offered team A X amount of money, team B Y amount of money, where Y is significantly higher than X, most players are probably just taking the paycheck because the future of Call of Duty esports and all that stuff is questionable at the moment. But yeah, I will always appreciate somebody who at least since we don't know total figures and salary numbers and all that stuff, I will always appreciate someone who seemingly goes for winning over the payday at the end of the day. But it's also different because in CDL versus real life sports, winning can lead to a higher payday with tournament earnings. So just an interesting tidbit, I thought, from that entire episode with the Boston drama and whatnot.
And that's why I picked the Ego Chall podcast. I'm over loyalty and becoming the best Call of Duty podcast. Zuma was offering me big money to be co-host of the Flank, but I was like, no, I'm loyal to the Ego Chall podcast, and that's my stance. I'm sticking to it. I mean, we've seen it with Temp. He had like a bigger contract with LAT, and I think he forgo part of his salary to go to the Legion. because he just wanted to play because he was with on the bench for LAT. But you know, like the esports to traditional sports comparisons are like really tricky just because the money is so different. Like you know, Freddie Freeman, like he was getting paid millions of dollars, like no matter what. You know, like if granted there was quite a few $1 million more for the Dodgers versus the Braves or whatever. And vaguely remember him saying like his agent didn't tell him about like some kind of offer that Atlanta had for him, and he regretted signing it or what have you. But it's very different with Call of Duty because like who knows what this is gonna do, like how much money it is and how much money it will be in like 3 years. Like Otani signed for whatever, like $700 million. Obviously, he's like a unique case; it's the biggest contract or whatever. But like the biggest contract in Call of Duty is a fraction of that. Like the absolute biggest contract, like Scump at his biggest in terms of popularity, in terms of skill, is like a fraction of what Otani's getting paid. So like if Otani sacrifices like half of that and is like, you know, I want to be with the Angels instead of the Dodgers, I'm gonna take $350 million. Like big whoop de doo. Like you still get paid $350 million. Some of these guys, like the minimum in the CDL is like $58,000. Like, and I'm sure there's quite a few players in the CDL right now that are making $58,000. So it's a big degree of magnitude in terms of these deals. But, you know, respect to Sib. We'll see if it pays off because, you know, if they don't win, then he went to a place he didn't get what he wanted out of it, and then he didn't get the money that Boston could have offered him. So we kind of have to play the results on that decision. Another roster change. Let's finally move on from the Boston breach after 40 minutes of breach talk. Miami, which was a very foreseen roster change. Real is coming into the roster after being signed like a month ago, and they said that they were kind of waiting on his visa issues to be resolved, and so now he is finally in Miami starting roster, and Eric Boom is out. So, I mean, Eric Boom is just kind of like the unfortunate party to the inevitable at this point. We knew just from the fact that they signed him and the fact that he did show some kind of promise early in the season with Carolina that Real was going to be a part of this roster, and the fact that Miami has done so poorly over the past month and a half that it seemed inevitable that Real would be coming into the starting lineup. Eric Boom out, Real in. Does that do anything for you in terms of Miami's trajectory? Is there any kind of optimism to be had for the Heretics at this point?
Really tough for me to say yes to that just because of how poor Miami has played lately. After such an in-depth conversation around like building around a young player for Boston, it does seem a little strange to me that Eric Boom is the decision here. Just because it seemed like he was like that, up and coming rookie for Miami heading into this year, where it sounded like initially he might get a shot start of the year, then obviously they go with Journey, but then they bring Eric Boom in for Journey. But at the same time, Real is still a rookie, very minimal experience from him with Carolina before the visa issues earlier this year. So I guess at the end of the day, it's a one-for-one swap in terms of just who that potential up-and-coming rookie is. So yeah, excited for him to get an opportunity. Obviously, had his difficulties early in the season that kind of forced him out of Carolina's roster. Now he doesn't have to worry about that. He can just play COD. I think even earlier in the season, like the online matches, he was playing from overseas, or
I think he was preseason. He was overseas, and then he briefly was stateside, and then he was gone again.
I'm trying to, because they weren't all in Carolina before when he was a part of the team.
Yeah, I want to say like before the holiday break, he was in the States playing, and then once he went back for the holidays, he didn't come back to the States.
That sounds
so
right,
he probably only played like 2 or 3 matches.
Was he playing out of Toronto's facility? Somebody was playing out of Toronto's facility, I think.
I don't think that was him, but I vaguely remember what you're talking about.
Yeah. Regardless.
Yeah.
The most important thing here is it's interesting that Eric Boom is the casualty of the roster change, but that was kind of our thing. It seemed inevitable Real was going to get an opportunity. We just didn't know for sure who he was going to fill in for. And just seems like Eric Boom's going to have to go back to Challengers, try and prove himself again. But this could also be another scenario just because of the way Miami's roster is constructed, where it's a carousel. If they continue to struggle with this iteration, they can bring Eric Boom in for somebody else. They already have him signed, so it would just be, a player swap on the current roster and the starting lineup. And who knows at this point what's going to happen. But I am excited for Real to, all the visa issues and whatnot, put him behind him. You can just focus on COD now and show us what he's capable of.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, but at least at the moment he is still signed. We'll see what happens. I mean, the way they're going, he might be back in there for 2 weeks. So it's really, he should be praying for Miami's downfall because he will get back in the starting lineup very quickly.
Eric Boom, you mean?
Yeah. Sorry, but yeah, Real, he looked good. I guess the very, very little that we saw of him in the CDL. And it's unfortunate that, the visa issues happened and, it does call into question what Carolina, like, I know Clayster talked about it very, like, kind of briefly on Twitter about, like, the lawyers and kind of, like, how they work through these visa issues, and, like, how Miami might have gotten through these problems, like, more quicker than Carolina could. Like if it was gonna be like this, then why wouldn't Carolina keep him? I mean, I guess that's a question to be answered by Carolina, who they probably could use him at some point, but that ship has sailed now. LAT also made a roster change. Afro out. Joe Deceives back in, who Joe Deceives, I think he got benched after Major 1, spent Major 2, the qualifiers, and Major 2 in Challengers, and now is back up in the CDL. Good move, bad move. I will say this, like, the fact that Afro has been demoted, like, it feels like the magic that Afro had, like his rookie year, like that second year in London. Like, I don't know what the hell happened to that, but it just doesn't seem like anything has clicked with him since then, with Minnesota and now LAT. And I didn't really get a clear answer when Nadeshot was live interviewing Ghosty on stream. I don't know if you saw that, but Nadeshot, like, asked him, like, why are we benching Afro, which is a bizarre thing for them to be talking about in public. And Ghosty alluded to, like something outside the game, like he still likes him or whatever. It was just a really weird thing. I'm glad for the transparency, but also a little creeped out by the transparency, if I'm being honest. I don't know if you had any thoughts on Afro's benching and Joe Deceives coming back in.
Yeah, I like Joe Deceives as a player, so excited for him to get another opportunity. But this is one of those scenarios feels like we've mentioned multiple times over the last couple of years on the Padres that a lot of these players, they get a shot, and if it does, their first chance doesn't pan out for them, their chances of getting a second opportunity don't always come around that often. And when they do, they have to capitalize on it. That's where Joe Deceives is at right now. Technically, this would be. No, I mean, he finished the year last year with LAG and then got signed by LAT. So yeah, this is
kind of like his third chance.
I was trying to think, but it's really not, just because it's, he played the full year with LAG, got signed by LAT, so there wasn't like a period where he was dropped. But regardless, he's back now. Excited to see what he can do again. Kind of just a weird situation where I don't really have high expectations for LAT even last stage where they were, getting a couple wins and stuff. But yeah, like you said with that, I'm pretty sure I saw he's back in Europe now, trying to grind through challengers, and I think that's after a couple failed seasons, consecutive seasons now being benched, if not 2 of the last 3 years.
Yeah, I think he got benched last year with Minnesota.
Minnesota, yeah, that's I just couldn't remember. It was blending with Vanguard and all that stuff, but yeah, going back trying to prove himself in the pit can only benefit him in the long run if he's actually able to go back there and dominate like a lot of people thought he could previously. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out for him. But yeah, excited to see Jodeci's back in the league again. Will be interesting to see what kind of impact this has on LAT. But again, outside of the top 4 teams, it's really hard to, um, say if this is really like, doesn't feel like a move that puts LAT in that conversation. You know what I mean? So
Mm-hmm.
it's tough to say anything beyond that.
So this kind of ties into like the remaining ROSTERMANIA things, but I have like a question for you, and I actually want to hear what you have to say about it. Do you think like players are able to tap back into something and like kind of, I don't know, like reinsert like their prime or close to prime? So like, okay, Afro getting benched by LAT. Arcides, he is now benched on Seattle, and 04 is replacing him. Illy has been benched by Seattle. Different scenario, I know, but follow me. And then Minnesota is unconfirmed. Awakening and Vivid reportedly possibly being benched in favor of Gunless and Standy. So do you think someone like Arcides, a former world champion, at one point one of the best assault rifle players in the world, two-time world champion, excuse me, do you think like these players are actually able to get back to where they were as kind of like that top level performer, like an Afro, an Illy? I I lean toward no. I think like in Call of Duty at least, it feels like once it's gone, it's gone. Like I can't remember a ton of scenarios where a player has kind of like fallen off and then it's like nope, right back to it. Like maybe a BZ had like that down year in 22, I think it was, where people were like, "Oh, he didn't play like his best. He hated the game or whatever." But like I mean, he was still relatively good for like the rest of the league. He
Yeah.
just didn't look like he just didn't look like an MVP candidate. But do you think like a player like Aristides can get back to like, top level AR status?
There's a lot of factors that go into that, but I do think Illy is actually a good example of that just this year alone. Beginning of this season, after dealing with what he dealt with previously with the hand injury and all that stuff, he really showed like he belongs and can compete early this year,
Mm-hmm.
despite everything else going on. Um, there are other things that can contribute to players. Um, you know, the biggest thing coming to mind for me is just motivation, a lack of motivation
Yeah.
in terms of and complacency. Like once you get to the top, not caring as much, just taking the paycheck and uh, you know have a nice day after that. Not saying certain people are doing that, but a move to challengers, getting dropped, getting traded, getting released, whatever it may be, that can be a motivating factor, and how a certain player responds to that. Um, I think directly correlates to whether they are able to get back to their peak level. I think a good example, potentially, obviously it'll depend on how he does, but Gunless, like you said, if that roster move is confirmed, that's another guy similar to RC's. You're saying an event MVP, multiple event winner, uh, hasn't been in the pro league for a while now. Goes into the pit, wins a challengers event, and now reportedly is getting another chance in the CDL. Um, and some of these other players, obviously the motivation factor plays into it as you get older, and priorities in life
Mm-hmm.
change and whatnot. That can all play a role in it. But yeah, long-winded way of saying I do think it is possible for players to get back to you know somewhat close to their peak if they quote unquote fall off or whatever. Um, but it all, there are so many variables that play into whether
Mm-hmm.
they can actually do that, and if they do, at the end of the day. And I think, at least in my mind, the biggest one is just that motivation. How will you respond if I got dropped tomorrow? What am I gonna do in response, and how am I gonna? You can either be like, oh, I'm so sad I got dropped, or you can get back in the pit and start fighting right away and try and prove all the doubters wrong. It's so how you respond to the situation is a key indicator of whether you can or can't get back to what you previously displayed.
Mm-hmm. I just think this is a very interesting topic, and it was Gunless was actually the player that made me start thinking about it, because I was looking at his COD Gamepedia, and he like the CWL Atlanta, the first event that he wins with E United. They're known as like the Warriors online, right? Coming into that event, and then I think they beat Optic in the grand finals, if I'm remembering correctly. And Gunless literally looks like a superstar, like not like, oh, he's good, like no, he looks like possibly the best player in the world at this point. That was 7 years ago, and I'm not saying like Gunless can't be a good player, but I'm like thinking, if Minnesota believes that I don't want to be rude about this. I'm not saying anything bad. Like I'm not criticizing him as a person. I'm just saying like I don't want people to think, oh, we're getting, IW Gunless. Like it's been 7 years. Like a lot happens in 7 years. And like I just don't see how like he's able to kind of like tap back into that. And like granted, he doesn't need to be the same player because like he's not in the same role. But it just like it feels different. Like it feels like sometimes players get the spots based on the reputation, and obviously he did do well in challengers. I'm not diminishing that at all, but like it feels like this might not be the best move in terms of their future anyway. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I that was my counterpoint before you brought it up. Was you can say, yeah, CBL Atlanta was 7 years ago. But what wasn't 7 years ago was him winning a challengers tournament
Yeah.
with Nikki D. Shout out Nikki D. Ego
And
Chall
when's
Podcast.
Nikki
We're
D
big
gonna get
fans
back
of
in the
Nikki D's.
CDL? I'll take that.
But that's that's another guy there who hasn't really been in there. He's obviously been Atlanta's substitute for a while now, and seemingly has been fine with that role of helping those guys. So he's one of the most underappreciated COD pros of a generation in my eyes, and that's a top conversation for another day. But um, it would be different if Gunless didn't just win a challengers event.
Yeah,
Minnesota
yeah.
was reportedly deciding to pick him up. I don't know the stats of this last challengers tournament and exactly how well Gunless played, but I obviously have a feeling he played pretty decently if the team ended up winning, especially
Yeah.
knowing like that FC Black squad is pretty strong. I believe they beat them twice, if I'm not mistaken.
They
So,
reverse swept them
um,
in the grand finals.
yeah. So, end of the day, we'll have to wait and see. I do know Vivid's departure was confirmed. I don't think Awakenings has been, and Minnesota hasn't confirmed any of the roster changes yet. Um, which is interesting because matches start in 2 days. But
Don't get me
the
started.
the initial news of Illy potentially being a signing for Minnesota was very interesting, and now that seemingly fell through. And potentially Gunless and Standy, and a reunion for Standy with Minnesota too, reportedly. So, gonna be interesting to see how it pans out. But I, for one, am excited for Gunless's return, and I hope he does well because he is also a very animated person, and we could get some good shit talk out of him if especially after some of the comments being made from others in the community who seemingly are of the mindset of sort of what you were saying, that like he's past his prime and been so long since he was a top player, yada yada. I think Gunless is, from a pure gun skill standpoint, he is one of the most talented pros we've seen over the years. Always been chemistry and behind the scenes issues with a lot of his teams, like demanding a trade from E United to FaZe and all that stuff back in
Which
the day.
which is a crazy moment in Call of Duty history, because it ultimately led to the Tiny Terrors on E United and winning a championship with Clay. So like these things, it's kind of like a little domino, and that ended up working out perfectly for United.
Yeah, but yeah, and you kind of skimmed over it too. But the Seattle move of Arcides and Illy both being officially released, they're picking up 04. I believe 04 was a part of the team
Yeah.
with Classic and Gunless. I don't know much about him, honestly, so interested to see how he does with this Seattle squad that just hasn't been the same since the Illy situation. And Illy seemingly alluding to the fact that he's done competing for this year. Obviously, that could change, but I think that's the first time we've even like really heard from Illy since the tweet
I think
after
so.
he commented on the allegations levied against him. So, um, yeah, that's the we'll have to wait and get final confirmation on the Minnesota stuff. This will look really dumb if Minnesota does a last second pivot and doesn't go with Gunless or Standy, but um that's a team I'm not really sure if I have high expectations for. I am
No.
excited for Gunless's return. But Gunless and Arcides together is, could be a little slow. Um,
You
but then
mean
again, Linz and
gunless and accuracy?
Standy. Yeah, what did I say?
Arcides.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, accuracy. Um, and but Linz and Standy, I think, could be a decent sub duo. So, you know, they'll have to figure it out, and could be some growing pains. But um, that's another team we're seeing them essentially wanting to stick with Linz and build around him. They're just not, Boston's doing it with guys who haven't really gotten a lot of CDL experience, and Minnesota is reportedly doing it with guys who do have CDL experience and have
Mm-hmm.
won major events in the past.
Yeah. I just want to say last thing. Um, I mean, I think it's great that players get rewarded for challengers' performances. That was like my main issue with like some of the preseason rosters where it's like, okay, you're bringing in a guy who has not really done anything in the last few years, and like it doesn't seem like you have a lot of like ceiling there, and you don't really want to even bet on a potential challengers champion, a player who's shown like very recently that they can compete at a lower level, albeit, but can win in a lower level. But yeah, I'm cool with Gunless being back. I hope he does well. And we'll see what happens with Illy. Though it is like a really weird situation. I wish people would just talk about it because it's like I like the cryptic stuff, like just come out and say what you have to say, and then we can kind of talk about it. um I think if Illy is okay, then I hope he gets another shot and he's able to play. And because he was Seattle's best player, like pretty undisputably, at the beginning of the season, and we haven't really heard anything from him other than saying that he's probably done for the year, and Seattle bringing in 04. So it's an interesting you know scenario, but I don't know what else to say.
Side note, I'm laughing because I just looked at the Illy tweet, and the top comment I saw is Patty P saying, "I see you cooking in something else in your future," and obviously alluding to X Defiant, which has been delayed 17 million times at this point. But if and when X Defiant is officially released, if that is during this current season, could be something. Maybe Illy becomes the MVP of X Defiant. Who knows?
Yeah, in 34 years, he's gonna qualify for retirement by the time X Defiant comes out. Um, but yeah, that's kind of the roster mania stuff. Just a quick recap: Slasher and Asim out for Boston, Beans and Pentagram in. Miami, Eric Boom out, Real in. LAT, Afro out, Joe Deceives in. Seattle, Arcides and Illy officially released, and 04 replacing Arcides in the starting lineup. And then unconfirmed right now is Big Wake and Vivid out, Gunless and Standy in. So, um, yeah, we'll see what happens. Like you said, only a few days left until the beginning of Major 3 qualifiers. These dumb teams keep doing this, and it's pissing me off because this is not how professional sports work. Schefter tweets about it, and then you tweet like 10 minutes later confirming that with a graphic. That's how it works. Figure it out, CDL. Map weapon changes. Let's talk about it. Invasion and Skid Row out. Vista and 6-star Hardpoint in. Invasion and Skid Row Hardpoint out. Vista and 6-star Hardpoint in. Terminal S&D out. 6-star S&D in. And we had some nerfs to the Rival 9 and the MCW. So literally the two most important guns in competitive Call of Duty. Stuns and frags were also nerfed. I don't know if you've had any time to play on it or seen any scrims or whatever. I'm fine. Like I don't really care as a viewer like what the Like sometimes you just I like when there's more, variation, but yeah, that's not how modern Call of Duty works anyway. So like we don't get variation, we get uniform. Anything else GA'd, so like it doesn't really matter. It feels like I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I haven't gotten to play any of the new maps. I know there were some initial comparisons for 6-star to raid. There were some initial concerns. One of the hard points was partially or fully underwater. So I don't know how that's going to play out, if that's going to be changed. I feel like that was
Sweet.
potentially something being discussed that it might be changed, but I don't know the current state of the map and whatnot. But seemingly the community was very excited that invasion hardpoint was gone. The bigger thing for me from that is just something that we have discussed multiple times leading up to this season and during this season, is that because MW3 was released with all OG MW2 maps, which were made when Hardpoint did not exist, it felt like an inevitability that some of the maps were going to struggle with Hardpoint, and we thought, that could even lead to some of the maps that were competitive in the original MW2 not being competitive in this map, in this game. And with Invasion, that was just a map that there was the initial hard points. People really hated that P5 and the embassy in the back. They even changed the hills up, and people still seemingly did not like the Invasion map. So now getting a fresh map in to replace that one in particular feels like a win, regardless of how the map actually plays. If it's a map that was created with Hardpoint in mind, or at least was created with Hardpoint being a mode that exists, feels like it has some potential, and it seems like the community is excited about them. And same kind of deal with Skid Row. I don't think Skid Row is a terrible map, but I know a lot of people had some complaints about that second hardpoint in that upper building in like the back corner that seemed like a
Yeah.
guaranteed 60 if you rotated. I remember like Optic in particular on one side, like Kenny rotated literally 50 seconds to P1 to try and
Hmm.
set up for P2 already. So, yeah, getting those maps out and getting some fresh ones in for potentially the rest of the year seems like can only be a W unless these maps are just absolutely terrible. But I haven't heard that to be the case, so excited about that. Terminal S&D, I liked it back in the day, but I know a lot of people have not been a huge fan of it in this game. So if 6-star is like Raid to some extent, not even if it's 1-on-1, just if it's comparable to that, Raid S&D is a legendary map, and if it's anything like that, that's a W in my book as well. So interested to see um, how that all plays out once we get to these qualifiers. The only other thing I saw from at Money Hill Stats on Twitter/X, they broke down the records for the maps that have been removed from the pool. And the biggest thing that jumped out to me was that Carolina is 3-16 on these three maps that are being removed combined, and 0-8 on Invasion Hardpoint. So in theory, Carolina is one of the teams that has the most to gain from these um, map changes, and that could be a big boon to that squad, which seemingly, since their not recent, but their last set of roster changes, seemingly on a better trajectory than they were before. So that was interesting to me. Notably, too, some of the other records. Toronto was 9-2 on these maps. Atlanta 12-5. Optic Texas 17-13.
They
So they
played
played it a
30
lot.
maps.
Yeah,
Yeah. They
and
had the most out of all of these.
yeah, and MYSL was 13-5. So obviously they're the best teams. So it's not surprising that they had good records here. I guess too, seeing Vegas here 11-6, so it could hurt Vegas slightly. But yeah, the one that really stood out to me was the 0-8 on Invasion hardpoint for Carolina, and the 3-16 overall um, record for them on these maps. And it feels like um, if anyone is going to benefit, they potentially have the most to gain from map changes.
Yeah. I was just really surprised with Optic. Like they
Yeah.
played by far the most of these three maps. And like granted it was 17 and 13, like they're not like dominating any of these maps, but just like I think the highest might have been 23 or 24 other than them combined maps. And Toronto, I think, had the least or the fewest number of maps between these three, only 11 maps. Granted, they did really well, but it'll be interesting. I don't know what the effect will be, but I mean, we'll see very quickly, I think.
Yep.
But yeah, the MCW now kind of like the submachine gun, and the Rival 9 kind of the AR, because the rotation saying that the Rival 9 now kills quicker than the MCW at every range. So that's nice. But
So what I've been hearing, I think it was Parasite on the flank or either on his stream, is there are talks around GAs potentially GAing the barrel on the Rival to try and bring it back in line with the MCW. But the thing, I think they even tried some of the other subs and like the Striker. I know I was watching Octane earlier today. He was playing ranked with Apathy, Scump, and Methods, and they were saying like the headshot multiplier on the Striker is just absurd, and like that's already been GA'd even regardless of these nerfs. So the bigger thing is that some of these guns were GA'd initially in the season, and it feels like historically and right now, GAs aren't revisited
no,
often, even in situations like this where a gun that is the gun is nerfed. Like we could maybe go back to like the Holger, which was nerfed, or sorry, not nerfed, was GA'd early in the season. I believe that's what Parasite was suggesting, was that like, the Holger isn't as good up close, but it's better at range, and that could be an option. But because it was GA'd early in the season, the pros aren't seemingly going
no,
to
they're
go
not
back
going
and
to.
revisit that. So yeah, will be interesting to see if this has any impact. And again, I haven't played uh, since the guns were nerfed, so I don't know personally how different they feel, but definitely seems like people that it's enough of a nerf that it's got people talking, thinking about potential answers in different guns. So there could just be a slight meta change, or it just will stay the same. But
Probably.
that's something to keep an eye on in these matches coming up.
Yeah, they're very likely not going to revisit any GA'd stuff, like long GA'd. The Holger was like a preseason, like
Yeah.
right before the beginning of the CDL. So I think that might have been Octane that said it last year. It's like players literally do not want to go back and start practicing with these new weapons. So it's kind of like a moot point at this point in time. But we'll see. I have a sneaking suspicion that we won't be getting a radically different meta anytime soon. But yeah, that about does it for the pre-predictions part of this show. And we actually do have CDL matches to talk about for the first time in a few weeks. First time since Major 2 in Miami. We don't have that many to talk about. I think there's only 8 matches total for this first week of qualifiers, but it's kind of like an appetizer. We're just getting a little acclimated to the restaurant. We're getting the drinks and all of that. So 8 matches to start, only 2 on Friday, but we get to see at least one potential new roster in effect. The beginning of the Major 3 qualifiers, Atlanta versus Minnesota. Minnesota potentially, probably, likely, who knows, debuting a new roster against the defending Major 2 champions. Again, this was my backup quarterback theory. You don't do this to your rookie quarterback. You don't start him against Aaron Donald, or you don't start him against the Pittsburgh Steelers, where TJ Watt, not JJ might, who knows what he's doing.
I wish.
TJ Watt's going to tear his head off on third down. You don't do that, but Minnesota is. We're going to go with FaZe, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I don't even know Minnesota's roster for sure, so I am not picking any iteration of Minnesota against the defending champs.
It could literally be the Optic Dynasty suiting up for Minnesota, and I would still pick Atlanta. LAG versus Vegas is the second and final match on Friday. I'm going to go with Vegas, but I mean, LAG, they showed quite a bit of promise at Major 2, but they're a LAN team.
That's what I was going to say.
They're
we
Lanimals.
saw the breakdown last time at Major 2. The numbers do not favor them online, so give me Vegas here.
Saturday, April 13th, we have 3 matches. First, LAG versus Toronto. I'm assuming both of us go with the Ultra.
Yep. Tough start for the Gorillas.
Depending if things go correct for them against Vegas. Boston versus Miami, two new rosters here. Boston, a completely different team, really. Miami, they're bringing in Real. I think that is an improvement over what they have been. Again, that's a very low bar that Real would have to clear if they're just slightly improved. I'm going to go with Boston. I just think, Miami has not proven to. I think they've lost literally 8 matches or whatever, 8 of the last 9. I don't know what their losing streak is up to, but they have been really, really bad. So I'm going to go with the Breach.
Yeah, this is one I absolutely had no idea who to pick here. I really don't want to go with Miami, but I want to make sure that we have at least one match difference, so I'm going to go with the Vamos here.
New York versus Minnesota. So we're going to see Minnesota for the first time on Friday. They're going to get at least 3 maps in, probably only 3 maps in of practice on Friday. And then they'll have to play New York, who just finished top 3 at Major 2. They finished 3rd, I believe, behind Optic and FaZe. Not a great start for Minnesota, but I'm going to go with the Subliners.
2.
Sunday, April 14th, 3 more matches. Carolina versus Seattle. That is a doozy and a half. I'm going to go with Seattle. Maybe officially having Illy not hanging over their heads as much. It's still kind of hanging over their heads, but he's not officially on the roster anymore. So maybe it's like a curse has been lifted off of the Surge. I'm not convinced necessarily, but I also don't believe in Carolina to the point that I can be overruled on the matter right now.
I do believe in Carolina enough. I'm going to go with them, and I think we're going to see some of these new maps potentially in there, and that might play in their favor. So give me Carolina here.
Yeah, I'm a little worried because I saw that Seattle was 5-2 on terminal search, and that scares me considering they're a much worse search team at the moment. They actually might not be because that roster is completely different, really. But Vegas versus LAT next up. So LAT coming with, I guess, a new roster. They're all kind of this iteration has never made it into the CDL, but these guys have all been in the CDL at least a part of this season. LAT did really good online last major qualifier split, and then things kind of fell apart on LAN. I'll go with Vegas just because they're more of a known commodity, but I don't think that this is an easy pick, to be honest.
Yeah, I do think it's an easy pick, and I'm picking Vegas to go 2-0, which means they will inevitably go 0-2. Yes, but I'm still going to go with Vegas here.
And then we finish with what should be a banger, Optic versus Atlanta, a rematch of the Major 2 Grand Finals. Atlanta, I believe, is 5-0 this season. I think they're 15-5 in map count against Optic this year. Which means that Optic is definitely going to win. But I'm going to pick Atlanta because I did not do as well at Major 2 because I was picking against Atlanta, and I've realized that I was a fool for doing so. So I'm going to go with FaZe.
Yeah, give me Atlanta here too, but that is an interesting one, especially given those map stats we shared with the new map set changes and stuff, and given how frequently Optic played those maps. We'll be interested to see what if any of the new maps do slip into this and how that impacts the outcome of the series. But I still will go with the defending champs FaZe up.
And that does it for our show. Pick'em so far this season. So you are 78-42, which is about 66%, 65-66%, I believe, if my math is correct. And I'm 80-40, which I believe is 66.66. And then Tremor is 0-1, which means he's 0.0000. So he's not doing well. He's going to have to pick it up very quickly, or he's literally never going to win a match again. But we'll be back next week, probably earlier than this is right now. My work schedule is kind of weird, so that plays a factor into it. But we will be back at some point next week to talk about these matches, these 8 matches. We'll kind of talk about how these rosters look, and if we were wrong, or probably if we were right about quite a few of these new look teams. and we'll talk about whatever else seems to pop up. Maybe Censor and Slasher will keep beefing, which that seems kind of fun. It's kind of like a side quest in a video game, or just you don't really have to pay attention, but it's nice. It's there for the hardcore fans. But we'll be back. Make sure to subscribe or like or follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube are the main places. Follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Pres Byers, podcast stories at Ego Chall Podcast. And I think that's it. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys as always for tuning in. A little bit of a longer one this go around, but we did have some juicy stuff to talk about. Probably spent a little too long on the whole Boston situation, but hey, that's the most we've had to talk about.
That's it for the season.
So. But yeah, thank you guys as always. Excited to get some new maps and some action, even if it is online this weekend. And we'll see you right back here whenever we go live again next week at some point. Until then, remember to send the chow.